Okay, so with me today is somebody that I've been wanting to get on for a long time. I think I first came across Damian about 13, 14 years ago when he gave a talk in Leeds.
It's a long time ago.
Yeah, back in the day when I was on the technical side of things, gone to the darker side of sports science now. I'm a big fan of Damian's books and, of course, the podcast, but I'll let Damian introduce himself. I'm really pleased that he's come on to talk to us today.
Well, thanks for having us, Andrew. I am grateful. I know that what you're doing is, in terms of the community, is really valuable, and I'm grateful and probably humbled to be invited on. In terms of explaining who I am, it's probably easier if I sum it up in three roles. So I've got one role. I'm a visiting professor of organisational psychology and change at Manchester Met University in the northwest of England. My area is very much looking at sort of culture, and how we build strong, robust cultures and cope with the pressures of change. The second job I do is I work as a consultant across quite a wide range of organisations. So I do a lot in terms of business, education, and a lot of work in elite sport, working with coaches to create these kind of robust, high-performing cultures. And then the third job I do is I write, and I also host the podcast called the High Performance Podcast, where that's basically where I was trying to take my research and try and put it, whether it's in book form or podcast form, or just share these insights that people can take away and use themselves in the real world. So they're the three areas that they all seem to dovetail and complement each other. But that's very much where I spend an awful lot of my time.
That's fantastic. I know your first book, Liquid Thinker, going back a few years now, but at that time, I think you were working sort of in HR, and was it with a chemical company?
Yeah. So the story behind it was that I'd never written a book. I mean, it's nearly what is it? I think it's 16 years old, that book now, which frightens me. But the context was that I grew up in a boxing gym in Manchester. So my dad was a boxing coach, and I'd worked as a boxing coach in the gym for a long time, and I'd done some work in sports. And while I was at university studying, and then when I was finishing it, I needed to get a job, but I didn't know what a proper job was. But part of the rationale was that in my insight of working in sport as a coach, I'd found that the best coaches were the ones that were passionate and enthusiastic and really loved what they did. And that certainly applied to me. I was worried that I remember asking myself the question, what would I do if that passion ever ran out? And I didn't want to almost be typecast of working in sport and not being passionate, because I thought I didn't want to get trapped in a world like that where the thing that you enjoyed had suddenly become the thing that you disliked. So I started thinking about thinking, well, what other jobs do I do? But I didn't know anything about the job industry or anything like that. And I had a girlfriend at the time, my wife now, but she sort of said to me, "You're not really qualified to do a lot in terms of the corporate world." But I had a lot of coaching experience, and I had my background in organisational psychology. So she said, "Why don't you think about sort of offering your services to business instead of going around that topic of change?" And HR was the obvious one. So there was a company called Unilever, a big multinational company. Thought my pattern was intriguing enough, and they took me on. And I remember this conversation. I remember telling my mum about it, and I said, "Oh, I've got this job in something called human resources." HR. She said, "What's that?" So it's called human resources, and she went, "Well, what's that?" And I went, "I don't know." I said, "But I've been offered this job as a manager, and I'm going to give it a go." And she asked the question that only a mum can ask, Andrew. She said to me, "What are you going to do when you get found out?" And I went, so I said, "I don't know, I'll go back to coaching." So I went in there and I genuinely had the thought, I'll get rumbled eventually. But the one thing I promised them was, I said, I'll work hard and I'll do my best. They're the two guarantees I'll give you. The rest of it, I'll see how I get on. So every time I kept thinking, I get a call, because I see it tomorrow. And no word of a lie, I used to think, right, they found me out and I was going to get my cards. I thought that was the way it worked, like in sport, where somebody could kick you out. So first couple of times I went into meetings expecting that I was going to get the sack, just thinking they found out you don't know what you're doing. And they kept promoting me instead. Right. So I was getting these promotions, and all I was back at night school. I was working to understand more around organisational psychology and how I could relate this stuff. And one of the last jobs I did, I ended up running these factories just outside of Liverpool in a place called Port Sunlight. And it was basically a turnaround job. So it was about going in and seeing if you could turn performance around. So I spent 3 years flogging myself. We managed to start turning it around. And then when I was thinking of leaving, I wanted to almost give them like a toolkit that said, this is how we did what we did, and you can take it away. So I started looking around for books that could give the lads in the factory, and it was all books in the factory, so that's not being sexist. That's predominantly male environment. So I started looking around for books. With these guys, I had 2 problems in trying to find a book for them that was okay. If I gave them something that was too wishy-washy, they'd be really cynical about it. They'd go on reading that shit. But if I gave them academic textbooks, they would need that because that wasn't their background. They didn't come from academia. So I was trying to find something that's had the middle ground, that's told stories, almost really practical, and was rooted in research. And I couldn't find, so in the end I thought, I'll write one myself, right? So I said, I'll write this book, but the only audience I had in mind were these 600 blokes that worked in this factory outside of Liverpool. So I wasn't planning to write a book for anyone else. It was literally, I'd write a book for them. So I didn't know how to write a book, didn't know how to go about doing it. So that was almost a blessing, because what I ended up doing was, I just set off on the journey, and I made a list of people that I liked to admire and thought, I'll go and interview them. So I worked backwards. So I ended up going out and interviewing Richard Branson, one of the ones that Nobby Styles, who passed away this weekend, Muhammad Ali, Angelo Dundee, Alex Ferguson. All these incredible people, I started going interviewing them and pulling their ideas together. And then I showed one of the guys from the factory, and he went, yeah, but Richard Branson's parents were rich. Or he went, Muhammad Ali had physical gifts. So he was still cynical about it. So I thought, what can I do to address that? So the last idea I had was, I started interviewing from the factory as well. So when we started looking at that, and she went, there's a guy who works in the factory that built their own house from scratch to cook his daughters in the area. Or there was another bloke that had built a canal boat that he was going to spend his retirement on. And my logic was, the guy that had built his own house from scratch for his family had used all the same mental tools that Richard Branson had done to build the Virgin business. Or the guy that had built his own houseboat for his retirement had used similar skills that Alex Ferguson was using at United in terms of planning and thinking long-term, things like that. So I interviewed these guys and put their story in between chapters to show how it almost doesn't matter what your starting point was. If you use some of these tools in terms of embracing change, you could make improvements in your own life regardless. So I wrote the book and literally just distributed it to the 600 lads in the factory. And that was where I thought, right, I've done it. And then what happened was, as a consequence, people started hearing from outside of the factory about this guy in a book, and I'd done it for the lads in the factory and things like that. So it was like people phoning up saying, oh, can I have a copy of this book? And I'd done some copies. I was giving them away to people, or I was selling them, and the money I was getting, I was giving to my dad's boxing club where I'd grown up. And more people inside asking, you can talk to us about this, you do this. So that was the premise of where the book had come from. And then eventually a publisher came along and said, can we buy the book? Now, at this stage, I'd already got a follow-up book called Leadership as well. So a publisher ended up buying both of the books. So if anyone reads it, the stories that are contained within it are still the same ones that I wrote, because I never set out to write a book for sort of the mass market, to use that phrase. It was literally just for that small audience of people that I'd intended it for. So yeah, that was the idea behind it, but that scares me now when I think it's 16 or 17 years ago.
That's made me think back to Leeds Trinity Uni, I think it was, and
that's right. Yeah. And I remember, right, I have to buy that book, and Oh, well, thanks, mate. I am grateful. That's really kind.
Yeah, I think. Well, I've read all your books actually, and I passed it on to some, especially the Barcelona way. I've passed on to
Yeah,
colleagues
thank you.
here, and the 5 steps of leadership, and I really enjoyed it. One of the things that, obviously, as you know, I'm doing my PhD now in organisational health, wellbeing, and psychology, and I think we spoke just before we came on here about sport and leadership and business, and I think that there's many parallels, but maybe not to the extent that we think they are. They're just completely different dynamics.
Yeah, it's true that. I mean, I often get that as a criticism, because when I sort of go and work with businesses, and you might use, like, I hear lots of people use sports metaphors for business. Do you know what I mean? Whether, oh, this is like a team coming together, like a football team, or, you know, working. And I always say, don't, like, so when anyone tries to labour the sport business metaphor, I encourage anyone from outside that world to say, be really cynical about it, because there's 2 things in my experience of being in both worlds where that just separate any distinction. One is some of the conduct that takes place in a sporting environment would never ever be dreamt. Nobody would dream of behaving that way within a business environment, like employment law, and just wouldn't allow, like, some of the language, the way people speak to each other, or, you know, like, you've worked in sports teams, Andrew, where if I want to, so if me and you have got a bit of a disagreement, I know I might get the chance to smash you in training, to physically smash it, and you and me know why we did it, but it gets accepted as, well, it's just part of the way that we do things here at training. Whereas obviously that would never happen in a workplace. So things like that can take place underneath the surface psychologically. But the second thing as well is, in sports teams, the punitive effect, you can drop somebody every week, which is a very visible punishment, or you can get rid of them at the end of a contract, where employment law doesn't allow you to do either of those 2 things either, quite rightly. So I think those 2 factors mean that when people labour the sport business metaphor, it falls down at that stage. But what I would counter it, and I do use this as an argument with some people that say, I don't work in sport, but I'll tell you what I do. I do occasionally work with people that work in the industry of sport. Just like I might work with people that work in the industry of law, or people in the industry of pharmaceuticals. And the point I make is, the people element is the same. The industry is unique. And I think, don't get caught up with the industry specific stuff. Concentrate more on the people element. And I think there's lots of learnings that can be taken from that element.
Definitely. I think that reminds me of some of your work when you were talking to Angelo Dundee about, you know, I don't work with boxers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, great memory. Yeah, so that was, it was like really seminal lesson for me, that I'd always been keen to speak to Angelo Dundee, and I knew him a little bit. And when I went out to Miami one day, I'm sort of enthralled with this guy. You know what I mean? He trained Muhammad Ali, he trained Sugar Leonard, he's had 30 world champions. So my background from a boxing gym, as I mentioned. So I'm sat there and I'm sort of hoovering it up, and I'm asking, oh, what was that fighter like? How did you prepare for that fighter? And then he went, Damian, he said, can I just stop you? He said, I think you're misunderstanding something. And I went, what is it, Angelo? And he went, I don't work with fighters. He said, I work with young men that just happen to fight for a living. And he went, but it's the young men element that I work with. And it was just a really gentle admonishment to me, but it was a really powerful lesson as well. Yeah, it's the people out there that is at the heart of all great coaching, great leadership. It's the ones that understand people that I think distinguish themselves.
Yeah, that's an interesting, a very interesting point, because I think it's sort of it can be easy, maybe for a newer coach or a newer sports scientist or whoever coming into it. And I'm very lucky here at the Utah Royals with the players that won World Cups, Olympic medal. I did count it once. I forgot. I think it was 7 or 8 now that have won back-to-back World Cups, Olympic medals. And it's, you know what, it's sometimes when we're in the gym, it's sometimes we talk about all the time, what was London like 2012? Oh, it was brilliant, but we didn't actually play in London.
Yeah.
We played in Manchester or Glasgow, and these are great. And I think you have to, I mean, I have massive respect for every player I work with, especially here with the caliber of player, but actually underneath that, when you strip that back and try and find what actually motivates that person, why are they doing what they're doing? And, you've got there because you're talented, but there's something on top of that. And I think that's something that you spoke about in your Barcelona book. Talent will get you in the dressing room, but it's how are you going to stay there? And I think the best performers in the world are the most consistent.
I think that is such an underrated virtue, to be honest, Andrew, because it's boring, but you're absolutely right. But that consistency. So the way that I think about it is everyone has good days and everyone has bad days. We all do, right? That's life. But the high performers, the gap between their best days and their worst days is narrower than everyone else's. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's their self-awareness that they know when they're having a bad day and they know why they're having a bad day, and they can recognise it earlier and fix it quicker. What motivates them. So when I work with coaches, for example, on this, I often point out to people and say, have a look at when a coach faces the press after a defeat, listen to the way they reference it. Because if you're a coach that comes out and you blame the opposition, the referee, blame the circumstances, the environment, what was going on in the build-up to it, that to me sets the alarm bells ringing, because you're externalising your underperformance. Whereas when you have a coach that after a defeat goes, you know what, we weren't at it today. The first 20 minutes was disappointing. Our intensity wasn't good enough. Our passing wasn't crisp enough. When you hit the specificity of it, that gives you a clue that that person has recognised what went wrong and they're able to fix it a lot faster. So the gap is narrower than everybody else's. And I think that's something that really intrigues me when we talk about cultures. That the best cultures are the ones that are consistent. They turn up every day, and there's a consistency to their behaviours. So I'll give you a neat example of it on an individual level. That I've been doing this podcast series called the High Performance Podcast, and I know you're kind enough to reference it at the start, but I've been doing it with a friend of mine called Jay Comfrey, who's a presenter on TV, and been interviewing quite a wide range of fascinating people, and I think this phrase of consistency comes across so often. Where it was really neatly encapsulated was that last December we were doing a series of interviews, and we were in Manchester. And the first interview we were at 10 o'clock, and about 7 and knock on the door, and I go and open it. I stood outside waiting for this to Chris Holloway. So Britain's greatest and welcome and Chris and make him get a cup of tea. I said to him, thanks for good on time, Chris. Really appreciate it. He was like, I wouldn't be able to. And I went, no reason, I just appreciate, it's not the easiest studio to find. Appreciate you being here. And he went, no. He said, we arranged at 10 o'clock, quarter to 10, it's a minimum. So I thought, this is an interesting answer. I thought, this is a look at this. So I said, what do you mean by that, Chris? I was only being polite. And he went, no, I know you was. He said, I just want to make it really clear. He said, if I show up late for a meeting, that indicates that I think my time is more important than yours. And by definition, that indicates that I think I'm more important than what you are. And he went, that's just not happening. He said, I told you I'd be here for 10 o'clock. I'm here at quarter to 10 and I'm ready to start. Now, when you sort of boil down, what we learned about Chris there were three things. What are the consistent behaviours that you think have made you successful? He said, respect for others. So you think about that in cycling terms, that's listening to people like the sports science staff, the coaches, the mechanics, the engineers. The second one is humility. So you don't record medal and think that you're everything. You prepare to learn and get better. And then the third behaviour he talks about is commitment. If I told you I'll do something, I'll deliver it. Now, those three behaviours of him showing up for a meeting relate to him winning gold medals in the Olympic Games. Yeah, of course it does. Because when you come under pressure, you don't rise to the performance, you descend to your level of training. And if you understand what those behaviours are and you consistently demonstrate them on and off the track, you show up like that in pretty much every circumstance. And that's why I think that I wouldn't dream of telling people you have to demonstrate this behaviour. People have to identify the behaviours that define themselves. But what I would advocate is high performance and deliver those behaviours consistently, pretty much on every occasion.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I've heard you talk before actually about values and slogans on walls, and how actually that probably doesn't motivate people, because actually when you think about it, values is just a set of beliefs that an individual has, and two different people have two different values. So something that that may be common in sport is, what's your values? Oh, that's it. That's what we're going to do for the rest of the season. We do it in pre-season, but we never do it again after that.
How often is that the case?
Yeah.
Like you see so many coaches that they do it where, like, I often get frustrated a little bit in terms of, because you're sometimes a call off, you don't work with those in terms of establishing. Now, first of all, I challenge the idea of values, to be honest, Andrew, and I say, don't talk about values, because values are abstract, that they're difficult to quantify, but also they're deeply personal and intrinsic. So I might hold a value that you would never know anything about, because it's not anything that's particularly visible, but I might just have that quietly. So I might hold a value that isn't visible. So what I say is talk about behaviours, because a behaviour, I can see it and therefore say something for it. So the reality is your behaviours should reflect your values in action anyway. So if I tell you that I have a value of kindness, for example, but you see me behaving like a dick to somebody, how honestly held that value of kindness if you see me sort of abusing that position? So talk about behaviours rather than values is a key point. But I hear a lot of coaches say things like they do it in pre-season because you've got time to fill and you should do. And the next time they go back and visit it, they lose a few games during the season. And when they scratch on for a reason, they go, it's that culture, we need to fix that culture. Let's go back to values. No, culture isn't an occasional thing, it's an everyday thing. When you culture isn't something that you do twice a year because you think it's appropriate. It's something that's at the front and centre pretty much every decision that you're making. Are you like, when I've worked most effectively with coaches, I persuaded some coaches to drop a player for a game because they didn't do a hospital visit in the community during that week. Now, that's not a personal moral judgment I was making, but the behaviour that we said was non-negotiable was teamwork. And we had one player that bailed out to do a hospital visit because people are going, and one of his teammates had to stand up for him. So I said, coach, you need to make that player that carries his teammates down. And one of our non-negotiables being the team player. So eventually, after quite a lot of negotiation, the coach agreed and went, right, we need to drop him. And we need to make it clear it's nothing that he's done on the field. It's like left one of his teammates in the lurch off the field. That's when you know that culture is starting to come alive, because you're starting to see that players then go, oh, right, this isn't just what I do on the field. This is how I conduct myself off it. That there's consistency there. That I need to be a team player when I'm in training, when I'm out on the field. For sure. So culture, if like that, isn't an occasional thing. It's an everyday thing that should be at the heart of how you train, how you recruit, how you drop players, how you reward people, how you communicate. Everything needs to be viewed through that lens, I would argue.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know when I was doing my PhD presentation to try and get a PhD or get onto the program, I remember one of the things I put up was all the books I'd read. I might have even had one of your books. Yeah, I did actually, on the slide. And it was like, these are all the books that I've read. This is everything that I've seen. I'm fascinated with culture, leadership, what makes people tick, and, you know, blessed to be in an environment here where I see this daily. One of the things I sort of spoke about, and it's not a slur on James Kerr at all, was the legacy effect. And I've seen it where from Christmas in a season, if you see a bit of paper, pick that up because we're going to change our culture. And I was like, what a load of, you know, because it's easy to take that and just go, right, we're going to apply that. But the All Blacks are the All Blacks. This has come over time and how they conduct themselves and the standards. And when you look at Barcelona in your book, and I think it's a really great story actually about how they chose Guardiola. I'll let you take the reins on that.
Yeah, so, well, I agree with you about the example of legacy. It's a great book, but the danger with it, and I think it has done this, is it's spawned lots of imitators. So I remember a few years ago getting into an argument with somebody on this, like a friendly argument where the England rugby team put out a tweet saying, "Oh, we've cleaned the dressing rooms up in Cardiff after they played there." And my argument was, doesn't that defeat, if you're posting that on social media, doesn't that defeat the purpose of why you did it? That you're doing that because you think it shows you miss it. Just do it. Why then post it on social media to tell everyone how humble you are? There's also a contradiction in terms of it. Now, it's an interesting, I don't claim that I have an answer to it. But the point is, I hear lots of people say, "Oh, we sweep the dressing rooms," and you go, "Why?" Because New Zealand do it. Well, copying somebody isn't a cultural strategy; it's a gimmick. Which always that's the point we were saying about having motivational quotes. It's a gimmick. It's just wallpaper. You know, like the one that always gets me is "Quitters never win, winners never quit." Yes, you do. I can give you plenty of examples of people that have been successful that have occasionally quit. And I can give you examples the other way around. So, what point are you trying to make to me with a quote like that? Because otherwise, it's just wallpaper, gimmickry. People through gimmickry. So there has to be something that links all the way back to those values and therefore the behaviour, and that's what you need to communicate. If you're telling me that you treat pedestrians because one of your trademark behaviours of your culture is humility, great, do that, but because of that, not because of New Zealand, is the point. But you're right about the development of Guardiola was an interesting one. So when I was researching this topic, I was fortunate enough to meet with two guys, Ferran Soriano and Jiki Begiristain, that know Manchester City, the chief executive director of football, not Barcelona prior to this. And I spoke to him about Guardiola, and I said, how do you conclude that a 37-year-old former footballer with 1 year's coaching experience in a reserve grade team became your head coach? And what I said was they pulled together and then they viewed it through three lenses. They viewed the head coach position. First of all, do they have the energy to do the job? The second one was, do they have the intelligence? So are they technically adept enough to be able to do it? And then the third criteria was, do they role model with integrity the behaviours they're going to ask to do? Because it's no point having somebody with high energy and a high level of knowledge, but then behaving like a hypocrite. Because people don't follow hypocrites, that if he's telling you that he wants you to be a team player, but then you're taking all the glory after a victory. Or do you remember the famous example where Alan Pardew was at West Ham came into where he was taking the baby picture that had taken all the Upton Park and then plays for show the training in a baby Bentley. People don't follow hypocrites. You know, the phrase "he lost the dressing room" happened shortly after that, because you can't tell them to do one thing and then demonstrate another, because people just don't follow hypocrites. And I think what they had with Guardiola was there was three trademark behaviours at Barcelona that were really important to them. Humility was one, hard work was the second one, being the team player was third. And everything that they seen with Guardiola, he embodied those behaviours. Was humble enough to know it wasn't about him. He was the hardest working man at the club, but he was very much a team player in terms of giving credit to lots of other people and things like that, which is why Soriano and Behaviours then were both really clear. We knew this was a guy that acted in accordance with values, that and we had no doubt about the calibre of him. The one area they did have doubt about was the intelligence of that he would have the knowledge to be able to work at that level. But they said that was the easiest thing to fix because they could give him a cabal of mentors like Marcelo Bielsa, Johan Cruyff, Juan Lilo, and a guy called Manel Estiar. They were almost like his cabal of mentors, his tribe of mentors, to use Tim Ferriss's phrase, to accelerate his learning process as a coach. But what they didn't feel they could do was get someone to mentor him out those behaviours, either identified an activity in integrity or you didn't. And that was what they were really glad about.
It's interesting because I remember during my time at Celtic and sitting with the first team staff there and Brendan Rodgers' staff, and obviously now they're all at Leicester City, or the majority are. One of the things we spoke about was tactical periodisation and how this has now become, this football-specific model and certain views on that. And
what does it mean? So explain it for someone that doesn't understand that.
So tactical periodisation basically doesn't see the separation between psychological, physical, technical and tactical. So everything within those sessions works from the game moments, offensive, transition to attack and defence, etc.
Okay.
So game moments. So then every session is then worked around that. And they talk about the complexity and how much information is being fed to a player.
Oh, right, okay.
It can brain fog and I think it's great. But one of the things that we actually spoke about was other coaches and who had maybe bastardized it a little bit. It's been taken from that Portuguese model, and I had said, well, I see that Mourinho was probably the first to use it, and they were like, do you know what? Actually, he wasn't, because Brendan Rodgers got his work from working on Jose, and he's quite open about that. But what they said there, what was really interesting was everything came from Cruyff. Everything came from his vision. And he was the architect of it, of Dutch total football. And, when he went into Barcelona, they weren't doing particularly well. I'll never forget my dad having dinner with Johan Cruyff and signing something, which I lost. And I've regret. But that made me think that actually not much is new. Things are just changed over time and different models, and it
give it new titles and things like that, don't they? That we rebadge it.
Yeah, and it was fascinating for me that Cruyff was the man that that they look back and say, well, he was the one that he wanted. And I think you spoke about it in your book about the academy in Barcelona and the behaviours that were in that to get you into that first team.
Yeah, but what Cruyff, I mean, I love Cruyff, but I suppose you could even go back pre him and look at Rinus Michels and the role that he did, and then before him, Vic Buckingham. The reason I mention those names is that you're right that so much of what they were teaching was common sense. But I think what guy like Cruyff was, they had a quiz to make common sense come practice. They asked questions, they didn't just copy, they took ideas, thought about it, reflected, and they came up with their version of it. And I think there's a real courage on that. And I think one of the things that Cruyff had done at Ajax, but came back to La Masia, the Barcelona, was he insisted that rather than have 12 different coaches playing their own writing styles and trying to input their stamp on it, everybody should play the same way. And part of that was because he felt the transitions then would be a little bit smoother, that you weren't asking a player to, say, go into the first team environment from the under-18s and try and learn a new style, that what they've been doing there would be transplanted into that first team environment. And I was lucky enough to interview a few of the players that had made that transition. So the one that was really quite vocal about it was Valdes, the goalkeeper. And he was talking about how that transition stage was made so much easier by the fact that he'd come through last year, that we was the same all the way up. It was just the demands increased in terms of the pace and the intensity. you're still doing the same thing. So they call it automismos. So some of those automatic practices had already been ingrained that made that transition a lot easier. And then he said what that allowed him to do when he made that transition was he almost became the bridge for anyone else that then came through after him. He would help them transition a lot smoother. So to me, it's just joined up thinking. It's common sense that when somebody says that to you, you go, well, why wouldn't you do that? But I think it just takes courage to take that common sense principle and insist that you implement it as a common practice.
Yeah, I think that's. I remember a former club where it was okay. We want our players to come up through the academy and understand the first team's model. And okay, so where are you going to start? Well, we start around the under 18s. Well, why don't we start from the under 6s or whatever? And but then the key question was then, well, what's the first team's playing model? And then there was nothing. And it was like, so you can't start to bring, we want them to understand when they come into training that this is what's expected of them. Okay, the expectation's there, but what is it? What's the playing style? What's the model? And and what I saw was like, okay, yeah, well, we need this. Okay, but when you break things down into the constituent parts, actually the top behaviours are filtering down and vice versa. We've got to be congruent.
No, saying it, isn't it? That if you don't stand for anything, you fall for everything. If you don't stand for anything, you fall for everything. And that's the point. Unless you are clear in saying, this is non-negotiable, this is the way that we're doing it, whether it's style of playing, it's a certain way that you identify, or whether it is, like you say, certain behaviours that say, no, this can stand for these. Unless you're clear about what that is, everything else is you're reacting. You're reacting rather than responding to it. Like one of the other areas that like I did some research and did a book years ago on Ferguson at United, and I think one of the things that's been really fascinating about him was that did he invent the behaviours of modern day Manchester United? No, but I don't think he claimed to. He said he tapped into what Busby had identified back in 1946 when he became the manager of the club, because there was three retraining behaviours in Manchester United. The first one was about relentlessness. So he said, that phrase, Manchester United never get beat. We occasionally run out of time, but we never get beat. So it's that idea that we'll just keep coming at you. A Manchester United team is just relentless going after victory. The second one was play to win, not play not to lose. So by definition of that requires courage, because we're gamblers. That Ferguson's phrase was that courage isn't about smashing somebody in a challenge. Courage is the guy that asks for the ball when you're getting beat and he's still shooting for it in the last minute. Moral courage to go for the win. And then the third one is team play. So you put the team of your own self-interest. And they were all things that Busby said. If we demonstrate these behaviours, we will entertain the people from the mills and the factories that come to Old Trafford every other Saturday to do it. So Ferguson came into Manchester United and tapped into that culture that had almost been forgotten in the years since Busby had retired. And again, the success that followed by following that blueprint. Now, you can argue in the 7 years since he's retired, that culture has been vandalised again. And so there's no coincidence that Solskjaer has come in and gone back to those values and behaviours that he experienced, that he talked about, that is the Manchester United way. Now, I hope he gets the time and the patience that people will allow him to go and to implement them, because this thing takes time. It took Ferguson 5 years to record his success. Even then, the culture wasn't firmly established until a couple of years after that. Kind of show patience, high stakes. Well, now people are not. Solskjaer's not the right guy. Well, we can speed up his technical knowledge, but does he have the integrity of understanding what you need to do? Go back to the Guardiola thing. I'd argue, yeah, he does.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember, I was about 16. I think I was doing my GCSEs, and Ferguson was on his way, maybe a little bit younger, actually, 15, and he was on his way out. and they beat Crystal Palace in a replay in the FA Cup. Then they won the Cup Winners' Cup.
That's right.
From there, and he was bringing the young players through, and so in some respect Man United gave him time, but I think Ferguson, for me, he understood what it was to be a Man United player, and he defined that from what I know, and the players then knew this is what it means to represent this club and this identity. And I think having an identity is another thing, which can help with a lot of things.
Well, it's been fascinating on the podcast. We've been doing so we've interviewed so far 4 guys that have like almost through the ages of Ferguson's thing. So we've interviewed Phil Neville, that came through as an academy graduate in Manchester United. We've interviewed Solskjaer, that came as a young player and was there at seminal moments. Rio Ferdinand, that was a record signing in the early 2000s, and then Van Persie, that came in towards the end of it. And you know what? There's a consistency in the message. They all talk about relentlessness. So Ferdinand talks about, like Van Persie said, he said the difference between Arsenal and Manchester United was, he said Arsenal wanted to win and Manchester United had to win. And it was almost that desire, that relentlessness that we do this. We play to win, not play to lose, and the courage thing was absolutely tied in with terms of what Phil Neville was telling us, that he talks about there's this great phrase that he spoke about with Cantona, the relentlessness of simplicity. So Cantona didn't do anything difficult. It was just simple passing and making sure his technique, so that he knew that when we came under pressure and we had to win, he showed the ball because of that relentlessness. And the thing with being a team player, that we talk about this, that he said that he told the great story about Berbatov. He said Berbatov, before the Champions League final in 2011, didn't come across in a training game and show for a ball. And they were screaming at him, make your way across the field. And Berbatov said to them, if I was at Barcelona, they'd just hold on to the ball and wait for me to get there. And Ferdinand said, they said to him, well, fuck off to Barcelona then. This is Manchester United. Don't come here and tell us what other clubs do. We've got our identity here, and if you don't like it, go to a different club, but you're not coming here and imposing different styles on it. So there's a consistency there that I think you're right when you talk about Ferguson, Manchester United. He laid it down. And one of his great lines he said, by the time I come in 2003, the law had already laid down. Those behaviours had been in place long before I got there. So I came in, and he said Ferguson didn't have to say anything. The other players told me that. He said his very first day at training, Roy Keane bawled him out because he gave an easy pass back to the goalkeeper. And Keane was saying to him, no, at this club, go for the win. You've got to be courageous, you've got to play the forward pass. Don't take an easy option. That's cowardice. That's on his first day. The rules of the game are being explained to you. This is the way we do it here. So, again, that's a sign that's how powerful culture can be. That's culture in practice. That doesn't just happen overnight. That was laid down years earlier and then refreshed and replenished and focused on relentlessly.
It's incredible. It's a very, culture and the environment you're in is something that we hear all the time, but actually getting it right is sometimes where there's a disparity. Now, everybody wants to do it and try and get it right, but not many people know how. So as I'm going to have to wrap up because I've got a meeting with my PhD.
So you've got the report, basically. Go on.
Talk about.
I've enjoyed chatting. So
organisation.
Thank you for having me.
But Damian, look, I'm a huge fan of your work and and of course of the podcast. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask what your 3 non-negotiable behaviours are.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, I explained to you where the idea of non-negotiable behaviours have come from. I've got 3. Number 1 is kindness. So act with kindness, and that sounds like quite an abstract, quite a soft skill sort of thing, and it isn't. I think kindness is the essence of doing your best in anything, because to go for your best, you have to stretch yourself and go out your comfort zone. And when you go out your comfort zone, sometimes you land on your ass. And I think the worst thing you can do there is beat yourself up and berate yourself. Oh, you're so stupid, so ridiculous. I think if you treat yourself with kindness, first of all, you said, I've done my best, I could have done better, but this is how I'm going to improve. I think kindness gives you the wherewithal to get up and go again. And I think when you start being kind to yourself, you then can be kind to other people and help them as well. So I think kindness to me is a non-negotiable. I mean, there's an interesting thing a few years ago, earlier this year, to be honest, when I applied my trademark behaviours, I just removed myself from social media because social media to me seemed to be increasingly unkind in terms of the way there was no conversation or debate. It was you're right, I'm wrong, you're wrong, I'm right, that kind of thing. And I thought this isn't the kind of environment to learn on it. So kindness is my number one. Second one is do things that are fun, because I think you think of anything that you've ever done that you've done well, you've done it because it was fun and it engaged you. So if you apply that as a criteria of if it's not fun and it doesn't engage you, you're not going to give your best to it. So anything that I try and do, I have to enjoy it. I have to see something in it that would be fun or interesting. And equally, when I work with people, that has to be a criteria. I have to try and make it fun and interesting for them. And then the third non-negotiable is make a positive difference. Don't do it if you don't feel you can make a contribution. So my dad used to say to me when I was a kid, he'd say, if your presence doesn't make a difference, your absence won't either. So it's almost like you've got to show up and offer something. You've got to go and be able to give a difference of some kind in an environment. So kindness, first of all, to myself and to others. Make sure it's fun and you can have a laugh. And then third one, make a positive difference. So that's been really interesting. When you have those criteria and you're really clear about them, decision making gets on greater clarity. Like, say this, for example, that when you drop to the line and asked to come on it, well, I know you and I like you. So first of all, it's the kind of thing, and I knew it would have a laugh. But then it's, you know, feel that I can see the positive difference that you make to your community. So it's like, well, do I like to contribute to make a positive difference? I hope so. So it was a no-brainer to say, I'd love to come and catch with you anyway and do this. You know, I've been into some environments, say some clubs, where you go, it's not a particularly kind environment where being kind is seen as a weakness rather than something to be valued. You go in there and you think, is it fun or does it feel like a slog? And then you also don't feel like I make my voice, not really. It's also like you just want a number of ones. And that's allowed sometimes to go, you know, it's probably not the right environment for me to come in and give you my best. It doesn't mean, like, we interviewed Pochettino when on the podcast, and he had a great way of articulating it. I hadn't thought this before. He went, you know what? It doesn't make me a bad person. Like in that situation, it doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't make the people I'm describing bad people. It just meant what's the right environment for me, and that's fine. So rather than go in there and keep clashing heads and falling out with people and getting frustrated, just quite quickly, when you're clear about what you're on, it probably isn't the right environment where those leaders can thrive and can be yourself. Quite early on, it was, we just agree that this probably isn't the right way, rather than get in there and both parties feel disappointed or disenfranchised about it. So they're my three, and I do my best. Do I always live up to them? No, definitely not. But do I keep them both and do my best to apply them? Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Damian, it's been an absolute pleasure today. I'm sure we could have went on for hours and hours. And such earlier.
Well, listen, I've loved it. It's been great to catch up with you. And you know what? I get a big thrill about seeing good people do really well and make a difference. And that definitely applies to me. Really love to see things so well out there. And the difference you make is phenomenal. So thank you for inviting me on.
No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks for the kind words. just a process, isn't it? I think you keep doing these things. And for me, it's all about giving back. It's all about, I'm lucky that I work with some incredibly talented people, but, I like to help people and show them that, there is a way, and you can achieve what you want in life, but you have to be clear about it. And there's by bringing people like yourself on to talk as well, it just helps others. So thank you. It's been brilliant.
Oh well, I'm really grateful, like I say. So keep on making a difference yourself, mate.
And you. Thanks, Damian.